rider, and I want to talk about what's missing from the bike industry, and that is compatibility and user options. Now, when I started riding back in the early 90s, things were a lot different. You didn't have a lot of things we take for granted, but at the same time, it was a lot easier for the end user, namely the cyclist who would be riding the bike, to change things to suit the way he needed them to be. Classic example is tweaking gearing, whether you're talking road bikes, single speeds, or mountain bikes, or just about anything else. It's sometimes, although not always, advantageous to change things about your gearing, whether it's crank length, whether it's the gears on the back, whether it's the chain rings on the front. Occasionally you want to just do something different, and that could be as simple as you want to put a 53 tooth outer chainring on your road bike instead of a 52. It could be something as simple as you want to change the size of the granny gear on your triple if you have a triple. They were very popular back then, less so now because we have compact gearing and stuff. But or it could be something as completely different as you want to run a different size front gear, but you have to change the cranks because the BCD pattern, the bolt circle diameter pattern you have on the existing crank, doesn't go down small enough to allow you to run a gear of that size. For example, if I want to run a 32 tooth gear, I can't use certain cranks because they don't go down that. They won't allow you to use a gear of that small diameter. So I'd have to completely change my cranks. Now, part of doing that is you often have to change the bottom bracket because the spindle length will be different. You don't want your chain line to be messed up. But you could do it, right? And if the new cranks had SRAM chain rings and the rest of the gears were Shimano, it usually wouldn't be a problem. If you used an old crank that had, I don't know, off the top of my head, Suntour, right? If you you used an old Suntour crank or an old Suntour chainring, it wouldn't make a difference. So on and so forth. And this was true, by the way, even after the advent of index shifting. A lot of people think index shifting made compatibility and changing gearing not a thing. Actually, you could still do it for a long time. Now, less so. The advent of more specialized drivetrains, parts where the entire thing is designed to work as a system, which, to be fair, it always was, but it's so much more so now that if you change one part, a lot of times things won't work. So you can say, I want a different chainring on the outer position. I've got let's say a standard road double with a 5339, and I don't want to go completely to a compact chainring, which would be like a 50 and a 34 or something. I don't want to go completely to a compact chainring because I think the inner compact gearing is too low, but I want a slightly smaller outer ring so that I can spin more. I can stay in the big gear longer because the big gear is slightly smaller. So I want to put on a 52 instead of a 53, or even a 48, right? I want to set it up like a touring bike or like a cyclocross bike. I want to have a mid-range outer gear, so I want to go to a 48. I've done it. I've done it on older road bikes, just like I've taken bikes that were smaller gears and I've stepped them up to a 53. Nowadays, you're going to run into some troubles. You can still do it, it's just more of a pain in the butt. And in some cases, you actually can't do it at all, and that's the thing. In some cases, it's just, everything has become so specialized that it's too restrictive. Now, for the average person, the average recreational cyclist, this is no big deal. They just, they buy the bike as it is and they ride it. But one of the great things about bikes is that they're fairly easy to work on once you get the hang of it. I kind of liken bikes to guitars in that it's really easy to get the hang of it, but it's really hard to get it really right. To get really good. Anybody can learn how to do it in a basic sense, but to really become really good at it, it takes a lot of practice. But that said, for a simple repair like changing a chainring where really all you're doing is, removing and then re-greasing and then retightening, what, 5 bolts at the most, your chainring bolts. Yeah, anybody can do that. Literally, all you need is an Allen key and, a few minutes of time. And for simple things like that, or like changing the rear cassette or freewheel if it's a really old bike on the back wheel to something with a different gearing or higher or lower gearing on one end or the other of the spectrum, or even if you have friction shifting up front, which a lot of us retrofit back in the day because it gave us more options, then you can take a 7-speed and turn it into an 8-speed. You might have to adjust your limit screws, but beyond that, there's a lot of options. I have a bike outside. My vintage Cannondale was designed for, I'm pretty sure, for a 6 or 7-speed, and I've got either 8 or 9-speed on it now. I don't remember which, but the wheel fit, the spacing wasn't dissimilar. A lot of times the rear wheel spacing, you have 120 millimeter is track. 126 was the old school road stuff, up to 6-speed, 5 and 6-speed in the rear. The 128 was kind of a middle dimension, and then 130 I think is the newer modern stuff. Well, this fit, so it's like, okay, cool. And I got the thing as a frame only. The frame was like free, and then I built it up with all kinds of old school parts. I think that's the one that's got the Drillium on it. But yeah, it has more gears than it originally came with. Works fine, and I've done that with other bikes. So, I've taken bikes that originally had gears and turned it into a single speed or even a fixed gear, and I've changed the gearing to suit what I need to do. And for some people, that's part of what's cool about bikes is that you can customize it to fit what you need it to do, right? And yeah, some people just be happy riding what comes from the shop in its stock configuration. But one of the neat things about a bike, unlike a car or an aeroplane or a motorboat, is that it's a relatively simple thing, and like I said, anybody can learn how to work on it. Not everybody's going to become an expert, but anybody can learn how to work on it. And it amazes me that the bike industry would look at something, like the ability of people to customize their gearing, which, depending on where you ride and what you ride, if you're riding in really hilly terrain, you're going to want to tweak your gearing. And in some cases, just swapping out your rear cassette might not be enough. You might want to change your front chainring setup. Well, what happens when you have cranks that have like some of the high-end Shimano stuff has this sort of lopsided X-shaped crank arm spider. Well, that only fits like special chainrings. It's the new Dura-Ace, the new Ultegra they came out with a few years back. The crank arms are asymmetrical, and you can't just take a normal 130 bolt pattern and throw it on there. It won't fit. The holes won't line up. And like, nobody ever thought that through. And then think about long-term durability. Even if you're happy with the stock gearing and you don't want to change it, what happens when your chainring wears out? Now, if you only ride a few times a year, or maybe just every once in a while, you may not realize that gears actually wear out. Front gears, rear gears, and chains all wear out after a while. And a cyclist who's putting on, 3, 4, 5,000 miles a year or less, but even suppose you're riding 4,000 miles a year, well, you're going to wear out parts, just like, and that's really not in a high amount of numbers. As far as miles go, I mean, back in the day when I was not quite so chubby, I remember putting on well over 5,000 miles a year sometimes. If you think about it, I'd be riding every day for transportation. Then on the weekends, I'd go out for a 50 or 60 mile ride, usually both weekend days. And some days I'd go out, after work. I'd ride to work or I'd ride to the store or whatever. And then when I come back, I'd go for a 20 mile ride just for the hell of it. So, your bike's going to get a lot of use. You're going to wear out the parts. And assume that, somebody who goes out and buys a bike that's equipped with, Dura-Ace or Ultegra, that's top of the line stuff for Shimano. Who would buy a bike like that, do you think? Well, maybe it's somebody who's going to be riding more because it's top of the line stuff, right? I mean, it could just be somebody who has deep pockets and they're a weekend warrior, but it could also be somebody who's actually going to be riding the bike a lot. So they start wearing out chainrings. And, 2 years they wear out a chainring. It's no big deal. They just get another one. But what happens, they have that bike now. It's 5, 6, 7 years old. We're now in 2000. Well, we're in 2018. But suppose, we were in 2020. All right. So that bike from 2 years ago is now, it's some years old. And they're still riding it, so they're still wearing out chainrings. They need to go buy a new chainring. And Shimano changed their bolt circle diameter again for Ultegra and Dura-Ace stuff. What does that mean? Well, yeah, you could probably find those chainrings on backstock for a while, but after a certain point, they're just gone. Right? So what do? You're going to ride that bike, and when the gears wear out, what do you replace them with? Well, you have to replace the whole crank, which means you probably have to replace the whole bottom bracket. And since a lot of these things are using non-standard bottom brackets, where the bottom bracket's either integrated into part of the crank, or it's one of these press-fit bottom brackets where the bottom bracket is actually jammed directly into the frame. How long are parts for that going to be available? Contrast that with your old school square taper bottom bracket with separate bearing cups, or even a modern, sealed bearing bottom bracket. Both of those have been around for years, and both of them will continue to be around for years. This other stuff, like how long are you going to be able to get parts for it? So even if you don't want to change your gearing and you don't want to alter the way things are, you're still left with the question of, like, how useful will that be in the long run if you're riding that bike a lot, right? And I see this with other things. Cannondale at one point had a hybrid that had a teardrop-shaped seat tube, which I always thought was utterly ridiculous because, don't get me wrong, I love Cannondale, especially the vintage ones. But some of their, early 2000 stuff was just kind of bizarre. And they had this, it made sense at the time. Companies like Look and so forth were debuting the Aero road bike concept, where you had a road bike, but basically from the seat tube and everything else back, it kind of looked like a time trial bike, at least in terms of the cross section, if not the seat tube angle. And the idea was a more aerodynamic road bike, which makes sense on a road bike, right? Especially something that's geared towards the racing crowd. What's the point of a teardrop-shaped aerodynamic seat tube on a hybrid? Nothing, right? Yeah, you can go pretty fast on a hybrid. I mean, I've gotten mine up to, similar speeds to what you'd cruise at on a road bike, but it's a lot more work and most people aren't going to do it. And generally speaking, on one of those, you're not going to be riding as fast. If nothing else, the gearing usually isn't conducive to it, and the bars are more upright and not as, your position isn't as, efficient. What does this mean? Well, there's no point to doing it beyond style points. It looks cool. It's a gimmick. Here's the problem with this gimmick, though. The seat post clamp had to be contoured to fit that teardrop shape. So instead of fitting around a round seat tube, which can be problematic enough because there's innumerable different tubing diameters, so it's very easy to, you're trying to replace this seat post clamp to just get the wrong size. But at least they're all round. This thing was shaped like an airfoil, which means you had to have a special teardrop-shaped clamp. And depending on how that works, if the quick release or if the Allen key, I can't remember which it was, but I think it was an Allen key, if it was threaded right into the backside of the clamp, that thing could get stripped and you're completely shot because there's no way to get another one. Nobody makes anything that fits it. It's a completely one-off size. On the other hand, if the Allen key went through and threaded into a nut or something, yeah, you could probably just replace the Allen key in the nut. The nut might not recess, the Allen key might not recess properly, but at least you could, hodgepodge something to work. But as far as if it threaded right into that piece, yeah, that strips, and what do? You can't replace the part because nobody else in the world makes a single thing like it. Now, I guess what you could do is you could drill the hole all the way through, and then get either an Allen bolt and a nut, or a skewer with a nut, quick release skewer with a nut, and put it through and set that up yourself. But the point is, the bike industry would be doing everybody favors if it didn't go down these weird dead end roads, just trying to be cool or have a gimmick or do whatever, and they're limiting the ability of people to keep their bikes on the roads. And again, a lot of this is like long-term stuff that most people aren't going to think about. If you're talking about the ability to find replacement and aftermarket parts, etc. However, there's stuff that's of immediate issue, which is, what if you're putting a bike together from a frame only? Either you had a custom frame made, or you found that really cool vintage bike that you've been looking for years, and you want to build it up with the mix of just the right parts, and you can't do it because the way you want to tweak the gearing, they don't make that. Well, what would you have done maybe 5-10 years ago? You would have just pieced something together yourself, and it would have worked fine. But nowadays, like I said, in many cases you can still do it, but they make it as difficult as possible. And because ultimately it's the tinkerers that keep cycling, a lot of the things we take for granted, a lot of the concepts and in some cases, whole categories of bike, like mountain bike, like BMX, which, a lot of this stuff started with somebody tinkering in their garage. And some new ideas are going to be, born by professional engineers in labs with drafting tables and stuff. Some new ideas are going to be born by marketing gurus who are thinking in terms of nothing but gimmicks, and those ideas probably won't last. But the ones that I think really last and really make a difference in the cycling world are the ideas that people just come up with themselves. It's not like somebody takes out an ad in Bicycling Magazine and says, you should buy this. This is the next big thing. It's that people arrive at it organically from their own experience, and they start tinkering, and they start saying, this is a need that I need to fill. How can I make it better? And sometimes industries ride that wave and build on it. Sometimes they just exploit it to death. Look at what happened with single speed mountain bikes. I still ride mine, but for a while you had every company and their brother was offering at least one single speed mountain bike. Where are they now? Like they used to say about old movie stars. Where are they now? Where are all those single speed mountain bikes? I don't see them in catalogs anymore. Some companies still offer one or two, but I'm dating myself. Catalogs. Yeah, I should have said web pages, I guess, but I'm old school. So what are we left with? Well, part of the appeal of cycling is that you can customize the bikes, you can tweak them to do what you need them to do. Part of what revitalizes the cycling industry, new ideas coming along and stuff like that, is that people can tinker with their own equipment, right? And if you design the equipment in such a way as to make it more difficult for people to do that, flat out discourage them from doing that. Honestly, there's a lot of new bike stuff that I look at and I think to myself, that's so awesome. I wish I had the money for that. But then I start looking at the nitty gritty of how it's put together, and I say to myself, well, yeah, I'd buy that bike off the shelf, but then I'd have to change the cranks, I'd have to change the bottom bracket, I'd have to do this, I'd have to do that, I'd probably want to upgrade this. And not because I'm going to be racing or anything. I mean, look, I'm not a pro athlete, but because I like everything to be just so. And one of the cool things about bikes is that, well, it's a lot easier to tweak your bike than it is to, let's say, tweak your car or an airplane, right? So if we make it less easy to do so, if we follow the trend the bike industry is going, where everything is designed so completely to work together that, and they claim, to be fair, they claim that this improves performance, and maybe at a certain level of, like competition riding it does. But let's be clear, the vast majority of people are either recreational riders or they're amateurs. The vast majority of people out there aren't racing for prize money and wearing funky colored jerseys. Okay, I mean, they might wear funky colored jerseys, but I mean, they're not wearing a yellow one, if you know what I'm saying. So here's the deal. The cycling industry, I think, is shooting themselves in the foot. What's missing is this, and there's a certain wonder to that. I still remember every bike that I've put together, at least the ones I put together for myself. There's a fascination to, getting your hands on even if it's an old frame that's, beat up and used, setting it up in the stand, getting everything, laying out all the parts and being like, this is going to go here. No, I think I'll put this here. And you're taking a pile of clunky old parts and you're putting it together into something usable. And that experience it's like they're trying to make it harder to get that. And one of the cool things in cycling is when you realize how all the parts fit together. Anybody can ride a bike, right? I mean, it's like the old expression, it's like riding a bike. But how many people actually know how their bike works, right? You step on the pedals and it goes forward, huh? But when you actually start to see how things are interconnected and how everything fits together, and that to me is when you're really a cyclist, right? When you know what those pesky limit screws do, is the starting point. The finishing point, I don't know if there is a finishing point. I'd say it's when you built your first frame, but I built my first frame a few years ago and I'm still learning, all right? I'd say it's when you understand what trail is, or drop, or any of the other esoteric expressions used by, people discussing frame geometry. But I'm still learning that too.